is yet another one of my favorite independent journalists, and this one is incredibly important to this cause because Kevin Gosztola has been on this case since day one, and in fact covered Chelsea Manning's case as well, and is one of the foremost journalists on all things whistleblowers and dissent. He's an American journalist, managing editor of Shadowproof. Please go follow, subscribe, share, all that good stuff. He also writes for The Dissenter. He's known for his work on whistleblowers, as I mentioned, and civil liberties cases, and has covered the court-martial of Chelsea Manning, the case of John Kiriakou, and the extradition of Julian Assange. Everybody give it up for Kevin Gosztola.
All right, everyone. Quite the marathon of speakers, and now I'm up here to give you a recap of everything that you've already heard for the last 2 hours. No, you know, I made this trip regularly when Chelsea was on trial and she was going through her court-martial. I was one of like 5 journalists that was traveling, which was bizarre because there are quite a number of journalists that live in New York and DC, and they can make this trip fairly easily compared to what anybody who lives in Chicago or on the West Coast might have to go through in order to do this regularly. We've had quite a conversation, a really good dialogue today about journalism and the failure of journalism and what it means to be a journalist, and it's quite clear to all of us that Julian Assange is a journalist. And that's the focus of a book I've been working on for the last 8 to 10 months called Guilty of Journalism, that's coming out in February. And I've spent quite a long time trying to prepare a guidebook in the eventual possibility that we don't want to be a possibility that Julian Assange is here in the United States in 2023 or 2024. But that's why we're all here today. We are here to prevent it. And we're here today because Stella Assange organized this amazing show of support in London that far surpassed anything we could have imagined. Somewhere between 5,000 to 10,000 people potentially that came out in London, of all places. And then people around the world said, that's not going to be the only event. And that was inspirational to me. That got me to buy an airline ticket and come out here to be part of this event, to join with you with this group. And Julian Assange is a journalist. He's not a source. The New York Times always likes to pretend like he's a source so that they do not have to take responsibility for what he did, so that they do not have to show solidarity with him, so that they don't have to treat him like a partner. Bullshit. And Holger Stark of Der Spiegel is absolutely right that the 5 media outlets, the main corporate or establishment news outlets that worked with WikiLeaks, should put out an appeal that says free Assange, that they should unite together, and that would be hugely powerful. But if they're not going to do that, then it falls on us in order to free Julian Assange. It falls on us to have moments of confrontation, not violent. We don't need to intimidate or harass anybody, but it falls on us to find ways that we can create moments that are capable of shaming people like Antony Blinken, like Mike Pompeo, like Merrick Garland, and others who might do events out in public. The kind of thing that you all know what to do because you're seasoned activists and you've been doing this for a very long time, and you're here and you're dearly committed to this cause. You have to create these opportunities like what Abby Martin did with the people who were at the Summit of the Americas to challenge this empire and what they were doing. You have to create those moments. You know, she stood up for Shireen Abu Akleh and was making a big point about whose lives are valued and whose lives are not valued by this country. And that's what we have to do. And just to give you some specifics, the last thing I want to leave you with is I didn't know that any polling agency had any interest in Julian Assange anymore. But within the last months, Morning Consult actually did a poll on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks and asked people what they know and what they remember. And I have bad news for you. Nearly half of US adults that were polled said they did not know who Julian Assange was as a person. Not even the propaganda that has been fed to them by the media. They couldn't even regurgitate that. They didn't know who Julian Assange was. And when they were asked about the publications in which he's being prosecuted for publishing, the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, they didn't know. They didn't know what this nearly 60% of people in London or the UK, in the United States, and in Australia, which has actually made this an issue. The Australians get a lot of credit because they've turned it into a political issue in which their politicians actually have to take sides. Well, that makes sense because he's an Australian citizen. But he's coming to this country, and we ought to make him a bigger political issue here in this country because that's the only way that it's going to become a thing in which he gets freed. And finally, specifically, we should start to come up with, whenever we have these conversations, specifics about what the releases revealed and, to us, what we find to be the most important. So off the top of my head, I'm going to give you 3 revelations that came from WikiLeaks that stick with me, and then I'm out of here. So the fact that they were going to carve up the Arctic Circle between the powers of the world and take advantage of climate change and use that moment not to reverse it, but to go through and find more ways to extract the natural resources that would now be exposed because of the melting of the ice cap. Well, there's one. We also know that relevant to everything that should be on our mind, which is the potential for nuclear Armageddon, we also know that the current CIA director, Bill Burns, was quite aware of what it meant to Russia to be under NATO encirclement. And then finally, because in my profession we've seen quite a moment in which there was censorship brought to bear against a colleague of mine who stood up for Rashida Tlaib for speaking up about Israeli apartheid. Let me tell you something that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks published that Chelsea Manning provided to them. They published a critical cable that said that the US government was well aware that Israel was proud to bring Gaza to the brink of collapse in its economy, and that was the goal. That was the way they were going to keep them incapable of fighting back and having any liberation. So I think it's important that we put specifics to this when we talk about why Julian Assange should be freed. And I also want to thank the organizers for inviting me and having me come out here and join all of you. And it's so great to see everyone. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Give it up for Kevin Gosztola, everybody.